Hitchhiking was a common practice in 1977. There was nothing at all unusual about 20-year-old Colleen Stan catching rides with strangers from her Oregon home to her friend's birthday party in Northern California. As an experienced hitchhiker, Colleen sized potential rides up very quickly, knowing when to jump in and when to just say no. Colleen found herself in a small town named Red Bluff on the northern edge of California's Central Valley on May 19th of 1977. A blue van pulled over to offer her a ride. In the van were a man, a woman, and also a baby. So Colleen felt confident she had nothing at all to fear from a young family. Cameron and Janice Hooker were the owners of this blue van that had picked up Colleen. And Colleen would soon realize just how wrong she was about the Hookers. This is one of the most horrific, nightmarish stories of torture, brainwashing, and sexual abuse. But thankfully, it's also a story of survival. Hey guys, it's me, it's Kimi, and you are listening to the Always Talking Crime podcast. Thanks for being here yet again. This is episode 28. I'm super excited. Are you excited? Because I'm excited. Anyways, guys, I'm not excited about this case. The only thing I guess I'm excited about is the fact that this week we are talking about a woman who survived one of the most nightmarish, horrific, gruesome, terrible crimes that could ever be committed against another human being. And, you know, with that being said, knowing that she survived, I guess it makes talking about this case a little bit easier. But I just want to give you guys some trigger warnings, okay? Massive trigger warnings about rape, sexual abuse, about torture, about kidnapping, all the things, pretty much anything you guys could think about. Trigger warning for if you are, if you don't like small places, you know. So we're going to be talking about so many terrible things. You just need to know that all the trigger warnings are out there, okay? Now, before we get started, I just want to remind you that if you could be so kind as to hit the follow button on whatever podcast platform that you're listening to this on, that would be amazing because it helps this podcast be seen by more people. And if you are feeling like you're in the mood and you're an Apple Podcast listener, it'd be super awesome if you could give me some kind of review. You could also rate the podcast anywhere from 1 to 5 stars if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. Of course, I want you to rate it 5 stars, but more importantly, I just want you to be honest. This is a learning thing for me. Right now, I'm just doing it as a little hobby because I love true crime just as much as you do. So, you know, I'm going to continue to get better, and the ways that I can get better are, 1, by practicing and releasing episodes every week, and by 2, listening to any kind of constructive criticism that I may get from my listeners. So I'm always open. You can email me with any suggestions at alwaystalkingcrimepodcast@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out to me on my Instagram, Always Talking Crime Podcast. So With that being said, let's get on with the story, shall we? Colleen Stan was born in Riverside, California in December of 1956. Her mother was a citrus grower, which kind of made her feel like she was growing up in the country, since orange groves require quite a bit of acreage. Her parents were divorced, so Colleen and her sister would go to their dad's house during the weekends. When Colleen was 14 years old, though, she decided that she preferred to go live with her dad full-time since she didn't get along well with her stepdad, and it made it difficult to continue living at her mother's home. I had heard in some of my research, or I guess I read in some of my research, that she had been sexually abused and molested by her stepdad. I didn't see it in all case sources, but I did find that in many. So it kind of made sense to me that that would be, an important reason that she would want to leave her mom's house to go to the safety of living with her dad. Colleen had dropped out of high school when she was 16 years old and got married to 22-year-old Tom Stan. She moved to Ohio with her husband, but things didn't really work out, and within a short year, Colleen returned home to Riverside. She took the high school exam and passed, but had trouble figuring out where she belonged until she met her friends Alice and Bob. She got along really well with them, as well as their 2-year-old son, so she decided to move up to Eugene, Oregon to live with them. She was really happy to have a change of scenery and get the chance to experience something new. On May 19th, 1977, Colleen decided to make a quick trip back down to Westwood in Northern California to go surprise her friend Linda for her birthday. It was a Thursday, and she was going to be coming back on Saturday. Colleen's car wouldn't start, so she decided to just hitchhike. And I know we know what we know about the dangers of hitchhiking nowadays, but back then it seemed like pretty much everyone hitchhiked, and it wasn't looked at to be any kind of a big deal. Colleen left her home around 11 a.m. with her roommates, Alice and Bob. They were the ones who drove her to the freeway. Colleen got out of their car, and she put her thumb up, waiting for a ride. The first ride she got was from a student who was going just a short distance, and they drove together for about a half an hour. After that, a car full of guys offered to give Colleen a ride, but she felt like it was too risky, and she turned them down. Another car stopped, but that couple said that they were only going a short distance, so she turned them down too. By 4 p.m., she took her second ride and made it all the way down to Red Bluff, California. All she needed to do now was exit the freeway, head east, and she only had about 100 miles left to go before she got to Linda's house. That was when a blue Dodge Colt pulled over, and Colleen saw a young couple inside. The woman was holding a baby in her arms in the passenger seat, which today that is cringy as fuck, but then again in the 70s and 80s nobody worried about car seats or even seat belts for that matter. The couple inside the vehicle were wearing faded clothing, and they appeared to be about the same age Colleen was, so she accepted the offer to get a ride from them and hopped in. Colleen was carrying a jug of grape juice with her, and when she went to take a sip, the guy accelerated, and she spilt the juice all over herself. The guy gave his wife a look. She frowned at him and shook her head, but didn't say anything. Colleen noticed that the guy kept glancing back at her in the rearview mirror, and it was making her nervous and starting to creep her out a little bit. Then the couple started asking her tons of questions about herself and even asked her why she was hitchhiking. Colleen was probably far more talkative than what was necessary because she ended up telling them that she was going to see her friend Linda and mentioned that it was a surprise, so her friend really wasn't expecting her. She got a weird tingly feeling up her spine while they continued to question her, but she brushed it off. After a while, the guy stopped for gas, and Colleen went into the bathroom to change her blouse. A voice in her head kept telling her to escape, to run away. In fact, she glanced at a small window and heard a small voice telling her to climb through that window and run into the woods to escape. But Colleen just thought she must just be going crazy. When everyone got back into the vehicle, the wife handed out candy bars to everyone, and they all chatted for a while about ice caves. Colleen noticed that there was a wooden box in the back seat that hadn't been there before. It was square, and it had some latches on it. The guy said his brother told him about some ice caves nearby and that they should all go see them. Colleen said she didn't mind taking a small detour, and soon they were off on the highway. The guy pulled off onto another road, and it wasn't long before the guy pulled over on the side of that road, and his wife got out of the car with the baby. Just then, the driver, the guy, jumped into the back seat right next to Colleen, which must have been freaking terrifying, and put a knife to Colleen's throat. The man forced her to put her hands above her head, and he handcuffed her. After that, he pulled out a piece of cloth and tied it tightly around her eyes, and he demanded that Colleen do everything he tells her to do. He tightened a leather strap around her head, and it made it absolutely impossible for Colleen to open her jaw. The box that was sitting on the seat next to Colleen had a purpose. The man had created the box out of plywood, and it weighed almost 20 pounds. It was insulated, hinged with metal, and there was a hole at the bottom of this box. The man forced Colleen to lie down, and as soon as she did, he put her head in the box and closed it. This box shut out all light and muffled any and all sounds. It also pressed tightly around her head, so Colleen's breathing soon turned into gasps. This contraption became known as the head box. I cannot even imagine how scary that must have been for Colleen to experience. Personally, I'm so claustrophobic. I'm sure there's so many listeners, listening to this episode right now that, are saying the same thing, like you're claustrophobic. I'm sure that if this was me, I probably would have hyperventilated and died right then and there. I can't even imagine being in that position. The man went on to cover Colleen with a sleeping bag, and then he called for his wife to get back into the car. When she did, they continued on their journey. Colleen wondered why the woman hadn't reacted to the situation when she got in, but then she realized that she must be in on this whole thing too. They drove around for a long time and even stopped for fast food. They took the head box and sleeping bag off of Colleen while the couple sat in the front seat and ate their burgers. When they were finished eating, they locked Colleen back up and waited until it was dark before heading to their home. Colleen was led by her kidnappers into their house. They made their way through a narrow door and then down a steep flight of stairs down to the basement. The guy stood her on top of a little Coleman ice chest, which is just a small cooler, and he hooked her arms to a pipe on the ceiling above her head with leather bands. After that, the piece of shit took her clothes off, and as she began to thrash around, he began to whip her. Colleen's blindfold slipped just a little bit, and she could see a magazine on a table that was open to a page that had a naked woman hanging, just like the way he had just hung her. At this point, Colleen had come to a terrifying realization. Her roommates were not expecting her back until Saturday, and her family And her friend Linda had no idea that she had even left to go hitchhike down there. The guy went upstairs to get his wife. He brought her down to the basement, and the two of them literally began having sex on the floor while Colleen hung from the ceiling above them. She had that ice chest underneath her feet, but the man would occasionally move it so that he could just sit and watch her dangle. Afterwards, when they were done, he finally took Colleen down and led her to yet another contraption he had built. It was a larger square box that he put her in, lying face first. This left her back open, so he was able to put cuffs and chains on her, which were attached to the top of the box. This box left her head exposed, so the head box was able to be put on her as well. The guy then also tied cord around her ankles so that Colleen was not able to kick. The guy left her alone for a while, but came back down and yelled because she was making so much noise. He told her that if she screamed, he would cut her vocal cords and that he'd done it before. She told him that she couldn't breathe in the head box and begged and pleaded for him to remove it. But instead, he wrapped a strap around her chest and fucking tightened it. So this made it difficult to expand her chest while breathing. He also put an object between Colleen's legs. It was an electrical gadget that was designed to shock her, but luckily, the device ended up not working. The kidnappers left Colleen alone and locked up all night, but the guy continued to come down every so often and just quietly touch her back. I guess it was probably to check to see if she was still breathing. This fucking asshole's name, by the way, is Cameron Hooker, and this horrifying situation Colleen found herself in had always been a fucking fantasy of his. He had been planning to do this to a woman for a long, long time, and he had even told his wife about wanting to do it just 2 years prior. When Cameron was younger, he was described as a happy kid, but he generally kept to himself. He did have a game that he would play with other kids, though. It's a weird-ass game. He would pretend he had a button in the middle of his back, and he would get the other kids to press it. And when they pressed it, he would fall on the ground and pretend he was dead. By the time he was in high school, he was deemed pretty much as an outcast and didn't have any close friends at all. He did excel in his shop class, though. He was very good with tools and with construction. He kept to himself a lot and had many fantasies going on inside his head. They all involved having absolute power over people that were completely scared out of their minds. And once Cameron started getting into porn magazines, that fueled the fire even more. After high school, Cameron got a job at a local lumber mill. The work was described as a bit mindless, and this gave him tons of free time to just let his mind wander and think about how he wanted to dominate women. In 1973, one of Cameron's friends introduced him to Janice. Janice was 15 years old at the time, and she was very insecure. Cameron was 19, and they immediately began dating. Growing up, Janice had always been extremely jealous of her older sister, Lisa. She felt that Lisa was the favorite and always got all of the attention. Janice had epilepsy as a kid, and this is why she thought her parents didn't like her very much. She thought that her father believed that people with epilepsy were possessed by demons, so she always felt rejected. It didn't matter how a guy treated her, good or bad, she would just latch onto them immediately because any attention to her felt like good attention. After a year and a half of dating, Janice lied to Cameron and told him that she was pregnant and wanted him to marry her. She was only 16 years old, and of course her parents were not in love with the idea of their daughter getting into a marriage at such a young age, but they gave their permission because she was pregnant. Janice figured that they were happy to finally get rid of her. Cameron and Janice got married on January 18th of 1975 in Reno, Nevada. Janice dropped out of high school, and the two of them had to get by on very little money. Unfortunately, Cameron's abuse ramped up even more after their marriage. Cameron would choke Janice until she would pass out, and then they'd start fighting about it. He actually put a knife to Janice's throat during one of the arguments they had and asked her if she wanted to die. One time, he showed her a story in a newspaper about a crucifixion and said that if he decided to kill her, that's how he would do it. Janice tried to be very submissive for the first few years of their marriage and went along with almost every abusive and sick idea Cameron came up with, but she could not do the gas mask. Cameron had gotten an army gas mask somehow, and he taped over the eye and air holes. Jan was really scared of this, so he would gag her to stop her from screaming when he would shove it on her head. This is around the same time that Cameron started talking to her about his fantasy of bringing another woman home, a woman who couldn't say no. He told Janice that he would go easier on her if he could do his experiments on someone else. But Janice worried that it would ruin their marriage if they brought another woman into it. Like, their shitty, abusive marriage wasn't already ruined enough, right? But, I mean, we have to consider the fact that, you know, she was extremely insecure and unhappy in her childhood. She didn't have any kind of confidence or self-love for herself. I don't know if she had any kind of mental health disorders. You know, we don't really know what's going on there exactly, because I didn't see any reports of that. But we do know she's insecure. We do know that she lacks confidence in herself. And yeah, so I'm sure that there was some trauma bonding going on in their marriage, and you know, she felt stuck, but she was obviously in such denial of her happiness and her safety. She insisted to Cameron that if she agreed to his plan, he could absolutely not have sex with other women, and he had to agree to get Janice pregnant. She wanted to be a mother. So they came to an agreement. Honestly, I need to interject a little bit here before I move on, because we all know that bringing a baby into the world when you're in a marriage like this would be the worst thing that you could think of doing. I imagine, just because I've been in abusive relationships before in the past, I imagine that maybe Janice felt that, you know, if they had a baby, that Cameron would change his mind possibly about, you know, wanting to bring another woman into the house, and maybe he would stop with all of his torture. You know, obviously, you know, she was not thinking clearly, because somebody's not just going to stop if that's what they want to do. But I'm sure, you know, I can imagine that she was having thoughts such as that. And that's why, you know, she agreed, you know, she went into that agreement with Cameron. But anyways, it's just sad to think that people bring kids into the world when they're already living in such a horrific situation, because it just like keeps like the chains of abuse and everything just going, and it's super sad. But anyways, the couple moved into a small house that had a basement. Cameron got to work constructing this into a torture house. He built a platform with hooks at each corner so the leather cuffs could be attached. He put hooks in the ceiling for hanging, and he started building that head box. Finding the right person ended up being the task that took him the longest. Janice got pregnant and had a baby girl in the fall of 1976. Cameron had all of the equipment he needed in his car, and although he stalked a few women, he never managed to kidnap any of them. On that night of May 19th, 1977, Cameron finished his shift and came home from work around 4 p.m. He picked up his wife and daughter, and they went for a drive. They drove around for a half an hour, and that's when they spotted Colleen hitchhiking. And I already told you about Colleen's first horrendous night with those abductors. The next morning after the kidnapping, Cameron took Colleen out of the box and laid her down on a table he had built. He chained her up and left that head box on her. She stayed like this for the entire day. That night, she was finally given her first meal. The head box was removed, but she was still blindfolded and chained while she ate. They started feeding her about once every 24 hours, and when she didn't finish her meal, Cameron would whip her until she passed out. And this became the routine. 1 meal a day, torture, and isolation. Colleen's roommate noticed her absence and got very worried. She was supposed to be back by May 21st, but it was now May 23rd, and Colleen still hadn't come home. So Alice called Colleen's mother to see if she had seen her, but Colleen's mom said that she had not heard or seen, Colleen at all. The next day, on May 24th, she called the police, and they were able to confirm that Colleen never even made it to her friend Linda's house. So a missing persons report was quickly filed. It was really difficult to even think about finding Colleen, though, since she had been hitchhiking, and really they didn't have any way to trace her travel. There weren't cell phones to track back then. There wasn't any social media. People pretty much paid cash for everything. So pretty much there was nothing to go on. The police believed that she just went off on her own and just simply was choosing not to tell anyone where she went. After that, her case just ended up being filed away and, was kind of forgotten by the police. Back at the Hooker residence, Janice was giving all of her attention to the baby. She now feared the basement and didn't want to be around Colleen at all. She even carried a shotgun when she had to go downstairs to check on Colleen. And it's not as if Colleen could even do anything to her because she's tied up. Cameron went about his normal routine, going to work every day. Colleen obviously had a lot of time to think, and she began to wonder how she could come to overpower Cameron. He was much bigger and stronger than Colleen was, but what if she could somehow persuade him to just let her go? She wondered if she could try to understand him and help him enough that he would want to release her. She didn't know how she'd get her old life back, but decided to pray for her freedom. Pray for wisdom to understand her captor. Pray to be rescued. Pray to escape. Pray for survival. At Cameron's job, the employees often took home lumber or different materials. Cameron grabbed some particle board for his next project. He built a box that was 3 feet tall, 6.5 feet long, and this one had a lid. It was double walled, so it was very, very confined and seemed very much like a coffin. Just horrifying thinking about it, right? Once it was finished, Colleen was placed inside the box, naked and still blindfolded. Her neck, wrists, and ankles were all chained up, and earplugs were also put into her ears. Colleen had been in this home for 5 weeks and still had not been bathed. She couldn't brush her teeth or her hair, and she pretty much just laid there in her sweat every day. Cameron installed a freaking hair dryer to her coffin that would circulate some cold air through the holes he drilled into the side. But of course, that fucking did nothing to help with the temperature. It's a fucking hair dryer. Plus, the motor had a high-pitched whining noise that Colleen could not stand. Soon, Cameron started to realize that Colleen had lost a dramatic amount of weight, so he got a scale and he started tracking it. After 3 months had gone by, Cameron finally decided Colleen needed a bath. He tied her up, tied a broomstick to her legs, and put her face down into the bathtub. Then he took photos of her while she struggled. After he dunked her many times, he had Janice try to work on all of the knots in Colleen's hair. She ended up having to cut a lot of Colleen's hair off, though, because it had just been so bad and it had been going on for so many weeks that Janice couldn't do anything with Colleen's hair at that point. Cameron spent a lot of time in the basement with Colleen. He would hang her and he would put a heat lamp up against her skin to burn her. He tried touching her with live electrical wires, and he would hang her upside down, strangling her and forcing her to give him blowjobs. Whenever he electrocuted her, this fucking ass clown would tell her that he was doing it because he liked her. Cameron decided that he no longer wanted Colleen to just lay around every day. He wanted her to work. So he made her help him build a new area under the staircase where he could keep Colleen. She was still blindfolded and had the head box on while she worked, though. I can't even imagine. That's a 20-pound head box. And how do you fucking see with a blindfold? Like, how can you even, do anything to help? I mean, it's craziness. The new design was triangular shaped, and it had a door, a ceiling, and some light. There was a concrete floor, and Cameron carpeted the walls for soundproofing. This worked great because Cameron was starting to get a little worried about leaving Colleen out for too long in the basement, just in case someone stopped by the house. Or what if a neighbor heard too much noise and tried to peep in through the windows? Colleen was placed in this new closet. She was still blindfolded, but she wasn't chained up anymore. Cameron left walnuts at her feet and said that she could remove the blindfold and shell the nuts once he left. This was actually the first time in 6 months that Colleen was not blindfolded. This was the start of a brand new routine. Now, Colleen spent all day locked up in the coffin box. She would eat at night, be hung from the ceiling, and then she would spend the night in the new contraption, which Cameron called the workshop. At night, she was given projects to do like macrame or crocheting. Janice would then take her creations to flea markets and sell them. Whoa. Imagine, right now, if anyone still has any of those items and they don't even know the backstory. That's just crazy. In 1978, Cameron was reading an underground newspaper and he saw an article that caught his attention. He read it over and over. It was something called a slavery contract. He wanted to duplicate the letter, so he rented a typewriter and he had Janice type it up. They also used some stencils for the calligraphy at the top, and they put a seal at the bottom that had an S with a cross through it. There were blank spots for signatures, and they made it look very legit. On January 25th, 1978, Cameron went down in the basement and opened the door of the workshop. This was the very first time Colleen had ever seen him without the blindfold on. He handed her a clipboard and pen and told her to start practicing writing her name, and then he handed her the newspaper article and told her to read it. The underground newspapers are produced without official approval. This was a paper produced around the 60s and 70s. He showed her that article about the sex trade industry, and it said that slaves who ran away were tortured or killed. Colleen felt that she was never going to escape this, and Cameron told her that if she didn't sign this contract, he would sign it for her and make her wish that she had. The contract gave false names for her captors. It said that their names were Michael and Janet Powers. She asked why his belt said Cameron, and he told her that was his name, but they have different names with the company. The contract changed her name to K Powers. Not K like K-A-Y, just the letter K. She believed the contract wholeheartedly she believed in the contract wholeheartedly. I'm sorry. I was like looking at all my words and all of a sudden they all just like jumbled. But anyways, Colleen believed this contract wholeheartedly, and she was totally under the impression that the company would harm her family if she ever tried to leave. The article said that women are forced to sign contracts totally relinquishing control over their own lives, their own bodies, as well as their souls. Sold into slavery, these women have no rights and no recourse. Their owners can do with them whatever they wish. An underground brotherhood of slave traders, as large and well-oiled as the mafia, not only controls this traffic in young flesh, but also enforces order, hunting down and punishing runaways. At the end of the article, there was a picture of a naked and bound woman. Cameron told Colleen that they knew she was there. And for a fleeting moment, Colleen thought he meant the police, but Cameron said, "The company knows." He said a representative of the company was upstairs waiting for her to sign the contract. In the article, it said that the company is a network of slave traders who turned captive women into profit. He went on to tell Colleen that the company had somehow found out about Colleen and they wanted her to be registered. Janice handed the slavery contract to Colleen, and Cameron told her that the company was going to take her away immediately if she didn't sign it. With tears pouring down her face, Colleen signed the contract on the line that said, "Forever Slave." Cameron put a collar around her neck and said, "The company requires this for identification." He told her that it had cost him $1,500 to register her with the company, but now she would be allowed to do things around the house, and the company would be providing security, monitoring their phones, and watching them. So if she tried to run away, the company would torture her if she even survived. Cameron actually went on and told Colleen that Janice had been a slave at one time and she had tried to escape. He said she had been hitchhiking and a policeman picked her up. Janice thought that she was going to be safe, but the policeman was also part of the company and brought her back to her owners, who nailed her up by her hands and kept her hung there for 3 days. When she started to have convulsions and they had to bring her down, they put her on a rack and twisted her legs, and that's why she now has the permanent damage to her knees and her hips. He said that Janice had to go back to work for her owners at Rent-A-Dungeon. This was a den of sex workers where members would pay a fee, pick a girl, and take her into the dungeon to torture her. If you killed someone, you had to pay a $10,000 fine. Cameron said that he saw Janice there and felt so sorry for her, so he offered to help her escape. Colleen knew the kind of torture Cameron was into, but couldn't help but wonder what the torture would be like from the company. Maybe it was worse. So she really had no choice but to obey everything in the contract. Now that the rules were established, Colleen was allowed to come out of the basement to do chores around the house at night. She also had limited access to the bathroom, but had to kneel and ask permission first. Cameron came up with a disgusting thing he liked to call the quote-unquote attention drill. Whenever he shouted attention, she had to immediately strip off her clothes, stand on her tiptoes, and reach her hands up and touch the top of the arched doorway in the living room. Colleen had to stand there like that until he released her. A few weeks after the contract was signed, Cameron casually tossed a plastic card at Colleen and said he received it from the company. It was a registration card that acknowledged who the slave and masters were, and she was supposed to keep it. As time went on, Cameron fed Colleen more and more lies about the company. He said that he and his brother were actually raised around the slave trading business and that he earned money by tracking down the ones that ran away. His father and brother were no longer active in the company, but if they found out he had a slave, they would probably want to borrow her. He said that one time a woman ran away and wrote an article about what happened to her, but the company found her 3 months later and pulled her fingers off one at a time before moving on to her toes. One of the members was a surgeon and removed her arms and legs without any anesthesia. Then they cut her tongue out, destroying her hearing and blinding her with a soldering gun. After that, she was hung from her hair by a hook next to her master's bed. So obviously, this isn't even real stuff that happened. But this is the horrific fucking shit that Cameron made up and told Colleen repeatedly. It totally brainwashed her, and it made Colleen fear leaving, and it made her fear telling anyone what was happening if she even had an opportunity to do so. Cameron wanted her to get a sense that she was much better off staying with him. Remember when I told you that when Cameron and Janice planned on kidnapping someone, Janice had made it clear to him that he could not have penetrative sex with anyone else? He was allowed to torture Colleen, but that was it. Janice eventually started to wonder if he had ever broken that promise. One day, Janice asked him if he wanted to bring Colleen upstairs to have sex with them, and of course was totally hoping that Cameron would say no. But instead, he ran down to the basement and brought Colleen upstairs, tying her to their bed. Colleen didn't even know Janice was in the room because she was blindfolded again, and that was the first time he raped her. He raped her in his bed in front of his wife. Janice was just sitting there crying and throwing up. I don't know if she was like throwing up in the bed or throwing up into something, but it said that she was crying and throwing up. And I just can't imagine from either Colleen's or Janice's point of view. Like, Janice is a piece of shit too because she's in on this, but she obviously has some major fucking problems herself. The house that the Hookers lived in was not ideal because they did have close neighbors and they were starting to get a little worried. They ended up buying an acre of land and got themselves a single wide trailer to put on the land. They still had a few neighbors, but those neighbors weren't super close in proximity. And they were happy to know that they wouldn't have to worry about a landlord stopping by anymore. Cameron built a waterbed with an elaborate base So they were able to fit Colleen inside a box underneath the waterbed. Colleen entered the box at the end of the bed and would crawl inside. Then Cameron would place a board across the opening, bolt it shut, and cover it with a panel. She had a bedpan inside the box and was only let out of that box for about an hour a day. An hour a day. During that time, she had to eat, brush her teeth, clean out her bedpan, and do chores. She could only take a shower once every 2 weeks. Whenever Cameron had a day off from work, he would put Colleen to work outside, filling ditches, cleaning pipes, pulling weeds, or gardening. One time he made her dig a rectangle hole, and he didn't offer any explanation for this. Colleen thought she was digging her own grave, but then he had her bury a heavy plank. He laid down a cement foundation and started construction. It was going to be an outbuilding which would be used to hang and torture Colleen since they no longer had a basement. When the construction was finished and he was able to hang Colleen, he would always whip her if she kicked or cried out in pain. The first time she was hung out in the shed, she was flailing and she accidentally kicked Janice in the stomach, and Janice was pregnant at the time. Yes, you heard me right. Janice was pregnant again. She was blindfolded, of course, and had no idea that she had kicked Janice. It's not like she did it on purpose, but Cameron was fucking furious. He ran into the house to get some matches, and he started burning Colleen's breasts. She was somehow able to disassociate herself from all of the pain, and she just went completely still. Colleen refused to cry in front of Cameron. Cameron did start becoming a bit paranoid, and he decided that he couldn't take his pregnant wife to the hospital when their second child was born. He was a complete and utter weirdo and thought that someone might switch fucking babies with them. He convinced Janice to have the baby at home and they could just call a doctor if there was an emergency. This is complete yuck. But Colleen was underneath the bed in the box as the baby was born in the waterbed right above her. Once the child was born, the Hookers realized that they needed to make more money. So Janice got a job at a fast food restaurant. Cameron worked during the day, and Janice would work a few hours at night. Janice had no idea whatsoever that Cameron was taking Colleen out of the box every night so that she could be the one that would have to take care of their children. During the nights, Colleen worked on macrame projects and apparently didn't follow direction on it very well. That would be me. I'd be terrible at stuff like that. But as a punishment, she was strapped down and shocked with electrical wires, and this permanently scarred her thighs. Cameron also built something called the stretcher. Once Colleen was fastened to it, he would turn the winch and that tightened the chain which stretched her. He would also choke her until she blacked out during this torture. One thing I really want to impress upon everyone listening is that the Hookers had people over to their home often. Janice's parents stopped by weekly, and Cameron's brother stopped by to visit a lot too. They tried to be very careful about what times they let Colleen out. They also got a dog so that the barking would alert them of any visitors. On one occasion, Colleen was on the floor scrubbing, and Cameron's father walked inside. She was wearing a nightgown, no underwear per the slave contract, so Cameron had to shove her into the bedroom real quick to get dressed. She was then introduced to Cameron's father as Kay and told him that she helped them out around the house. In fact, the entire time Colleen was around their 2 young daughters, neither of them even realized that their parents held Colleen there against her will. They also didn't even know that Colleen lived at their house, much less underneath their parents' bed in a wooden box, because Cameron and Janice told both of them that Colleen went to her own home every night. Craziness. In 1979, Janice asked Colleen what she would like for a gift. She didn't know what it was for, but she worked up the courage to ask for a Bible. And she did actually receive a Bible on January 11th. The front page was signed and dated by Cameron and Janice. The prayers gave Colleen inspiration, and she read the Bible whenever she got a chance to be in the light. Colleen refers to a certain time frame as the year out because she was out for longer periods of time each day. She worked outside in the vegetable garden. She babysat the 2 kids, and she was allowed to shop in town sometimes. She was proving herself to the Hookers so that they would trust her. When she went out, she obviously couldn't wear a collar around her neck, so Cameron had another idea. He told Colleen that the company still needs her to wear identification, so he took a needle and he pierced her. He placed a gold earring through her right labia, and he told her it was a symbolic wedding ring. Ew. In March 1981, after more than 3 years of captivity, Cameron took Colleen up to Oregon to visit her parents. His threats of the company frightened Colleen so much, to the extent that she did not dare tell her mother and father that she had been held captive and forced to sign a slave contract. Instead, Colleen introduced Cameron to them as her fiancé, never letting her family know that he was holding her against her will. Her parents even took a picture of the quote-unquote happy couple to document being reunited with their daughter and meeting the man they thought she was intending on getting married to. Colleen's parents were concerned for their daughter, mainly because they had the feeling like she had joined a cult, but they weren't aware of the years of abuse she had suffered. They didn't say anything to her either because they didn't want her to leave and never come back. So it was just kind of like the elephant in the room. Nobody kind of talked about where she had been, where she was gone to. They noticed that her clothing was clothing that she would have never worn before. I guess it was just like homemade style clothing. So they were, of course, like super worried about her, but they focused more on the fact of being joyful and excited that Colleen was back. Once the visit was over, Cameron brought Colleen back to their trailer, and he revoked all improvements that had previously been given to Colleen in the past year, and he was subjecting her again to the conditions of her early captivity. In 1983, he finished building a pit under a shed in the property, and he moved Colleen's box out there. In May of 1984, though, Cameron allowed Colleen to take a part-time job as a motel maid under the alias K Powers, and also let her attend church services as long as she went with Janice. She was also afforded opportunities to go jogging unsupervised, but all the while, Colleen never ran away because she still believed Cameron's made-up story about the company. She was so fearful that the company would be worse torture than what she was already receiving. She was terrified that they would find her family and her friends and kill all of them if she tried to escape. The turning point came in 1984 when Cameron announced to Janice that he wanted to make Colleen his second wife and bring in more female slaves. Janice was pissed. For all these years, Janice had always seen Colleen as her rival. But things did a complete 180 when Janice went to a pastor and told him everything that had been going on. When the pastor advised Janice, that she should leave the marriage, Janice went to the motel where Colleen was working and told her that there was no company. And armed with that information and learning that she was able to leave without any repercussions, Colleen left. But before she left, she called Cameron from a bus station payphone. She told him she was leaving. Cameron was fucking crying. And later on in a court testimony, he described this conversation as a hard goodbye from a woman he loved. Fucking nut job. Mark Olver, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Saskatchewan, who specializes in sexual deviance and psychopathy, says, "It's hard, but not impossible, to imagine that someone as psychopathic as Cameron Hooker may just mourn the loss of a victim relationship the same way that well-adjusted people mourn the termination of their romantic relationships and partnerships." He had told A&E True Crime this: "People who are so psychopathic are so self-serving, but it's possible he could have had an attachment to her, as sadistic and one-sided and brutal and terrorizing the relationship was. But I don't know if it's an attachment or just the loss of the human sex object." So even then, Colleen agreed with Janice not to go to the police in order to give Cameron a chance to reform. Janice also burned the original slave contract, although a copy was found later. Janice called the police to report Cameron's crime about 3 months later. So apparently, Cameron wasn't changing. He wasn't reforming like she had hoped. So I think she went and talked to the pastor again too. And although pastors, I don't know if pastors are upheld by the same laws of, how you have to keep things secret as priests will have to in the Catholic Church. I'm not so sure about pastors, but the pastor upheld the confidentiality, and he, from what I understand, got Janice to understand that she needed to report everything because nothing, was changing. So Janice reported both Colleen Stan's abduction as well as the murder of an earlier abductee by the name of Marlies Sponhawk. I'm sorry, I just butchered that name. I practiced it so many times, and when it came time to say it, I fucked it up. Anyways, let me try it again. Her name was Marlies Sponhawk, who I'm going to tell you more about in just a second. Although Janice had had second thoughts and had helped Cameron destroy some of the evidence that would have helped convict him, she ultimately worked as a cooperating witness against Cameron in exchange for total immunity. Janice still lives in California right now, under another name, by the way. Since the police were unable to locate Marlies's body, Cameron could only be charged with the crimes committed against Colleen Stan. So the Hookers had picked up 19-year-old hitchhiker Marlies Sponhawk in Chico, California on January 31st of 1976. They drove her to her intended destination, but as she was getting out of the vehicle, Cameron grabbed her and forced her back into the car. Marlies was brought back to the Hooker home, where she was hung from her wrists in the basement, undressed, and tortured for an entire day. She was then shot in the stomach with a pellet gun and strangled by Cameron. Her body was later buried in a shallow grave near Lassen Volcanic National Park, and it was never recovered. At the time, the police suspected that Marliz's boyfriend was responsible for her disappearance because the two of them had had an argument just before Marliz had disappeared. Apparently, they had been out shopping at a flea market or something downtown, and they had gotten into a little argument, so Marliz had taken off by herself and just started walking alone. That's when Cameron and Janice came upon her. Between Janice's testimony, Colleen's testimony, and evidence that was collected at the scene, most notably a copy of that master-slave contract, Cameron Hooker was convicted of kidnapping, using a knife in an abduction, rape, and sexual abuse on October 31st of 1985. Cameron was sentenced to 104 years in prison on November 22nd. Judge Clarence Knight remarked at the time that Hooker is, quote, the most dangerous psychopath I have ever dealt with, who will be a danger to women as long as he is alive. After the sentencing, fucking Cameron turned to his attorney and said this: I want you to thank the judge for me. I have a library, a gym, and the time to enjoy them, and it's better than living with those two women. Ugh, loser. Anyway, Cameron is currently serving his sentence at the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison in Corcoran, California, I believe that is. In 2014, he was denied parole for 15 more years. However, because COVID-19 has inspired new prison releases, there is a chance that Cameron could come up for parole again, something that the local Sheriff's Association 10,000% opposes. And so do we. All those sex offenders who are Cameron's age, because now he's in his late 60s, don't tend to reoffend nearly as much as those who are younger. Cameron's underlying psychopathy is extreme, and it's unlikely that it would have disappeared. I mean, he's still going to be just as bad as ever. It's one thing to rehabilitate a one-time violent robber, but it's another thing entirely to make a sadist like Cameron Hooker better. Tehama County District Attorney Matthew Rogers and others have made efforts to stop Cameron from being allowed out of confinement. He says, because of changes to California sentencing law, his sentence was reduced down based on changes to credit calculations and things like that. A judge heard the evidence from the state doctors and determined that there is probable cause to believe that Cameron Hooker does meet the definition of a sexually violent predator. Since a judge has now determined that there is probable cause that Cameron is indeed a sexually violent predator, he will go to trial, which District Attorney Rogers says that this could either be done through a court or a jury trial. If in that trial Cameron is found to be a sexually violent predator, he will not be paroled, but instead he will be confined to a state mental hospital. If that trial successfully determines that Cameron is not a sexually violent predator, he could get released if officials determine that he's been rehabilitated. But even if that happened, Rogers said that the entire process could literally take 10 to 20 years for a man who is already considered a senior citizen anyway. So would he even get out and be paroled even if all those things happened? Probably not. Colleen Stan, who has also spoken out, seems confident that Cameron will likely never be released. But she is concerned about violent offenders being released early from prison in California. She said, quote, "We hear stories of people that have been let out early all the time that then go out and reoffend. So absolutely, I think it's an atrocity that they are not doing anything to try to protect us anymore, and they're just letting these people out," end quote. Cameron Hooker will be returning to court on September 14th of 2022 to set the date of his trial. So personally, I don't feel like he's going to get out. I feel that they are going to find him as a sexually violent predator. So I don't think he has any hopes of anything else. I think that they're just going to confine him to that mental institution and throw away the key. Too bad that they can't put him in a fucking coffin or that same motherfucking box that he kept Colleen in. Wouldn't that be justice? I think so. Or like have him hanging in the corner of the room while everybody else goes on about their day. But yeah, what are your thoughts, guys? Bring it on over to Instagram. Let me know what you're thinking. We can talk about it in the Patreon because, as you know, like these episodes, patrons get them a day earlier than, they are released on every other platform. But we can have some discussions. Let me know what you guys think about, what the outcome's going to be. At any rate, that should be pretty interesting to follow when when the trial starts. I don't know when it would start. If they're going to be, scheduling it in September, then I would imagine maybe November or December. Hopefully not longer than that, but it will be interesting to follow for sure. But yeah, this was another terrifying case. I mean, they all are. The only thing, that we can be happy about is that he's been put away. And Colleen is still alive. I don't remember, I think it was on Netflix. It's either Netflix or YouTube. There, is the Girl in the Box, the Girl in the Box documentary, and it's so good. It was really intriguing to listen to the story and all the commentary by Colleen herself. She's like my mom's age, and I was like just thinking back to the time that Colleen, had been held captive and was tortured, and I was thinking about, that could have been my mom, just things like that, and I was thinking about, during that time what I was doing in my life, it's just absolute insanity to think about that. And what a strong, courageous woman she is for speaking out about it now and being interviewed and being brave enough to do that. I think that at first her and Janice may have kept in touch, but I know that they don't. I know she said that they don't keep in touch at all anymore, and like I already said, Janice goes by another name. I'm not sure how to feel about her being given immunity in exchange for her testimony, but I understand that that was also, an important thing so that they could, put Cameron away forever. Well, 104 years anyways, hopefully. But, yeah, so I mean, who knows if they would have had enough evidence without Janice's testimony. I mean, he would have still maybe been found guilty, but maybe it would not have been such an easy case to prosecute. So as long as he is put away, then, I guess if the police are okay with Janice being let go and given immunity, then I guess I can be too. But yeah, I'm not happy about that woman at all. But hopefully she has gotten help and therapy for anything that was, going wrong or anything that was missing in her life that just caused her to, you know, be the type of person that would be so influenced and just, you know, I don't know, just let him do all of those things. Oh, that's a long ass time for Colleen Stan to be subjected to that. So prayers and happy vibes to her. I know that she has, you know, had some struggles after the fact. I think she has like a marriage that, you know, was unsuccessful. She does have a child. I know that child grew up and is currently an inmate in prison. So I don't know the details on that. Quite honestly, I didn't really want to dive in far enough to find out what her daughter had done to be put away in prison. So I don't know. I didn't want to go that far into it. I just hope that she has some kind of peace, and I'm sure she's had plenty of therapy, but I imagine her anxiety is still through the roof. I mean, my anxiety is through the roof sometimes, and I only talk about these things. I've never actually gone through any of it, so, but, you know, big props to her for being a fucking badass for sure. I did also want to make a small note that if you're interested in ghost stories, I'm not going to elaborate, you know, really far into detail on this, but Marliz, the first victim, the victim that Cameron had murdered, her home that she shared with her fiance is haunted, and many people who have lived there since Marliz's abduction and murder have reported the same types of things happening. They start dreaming about her. Just strange ass things happen, and it's not just like one family or one or two people. It's like been ongoing ever since Marliz disappeared. So that's kind of cranky. So if you want to research Marliz Spinaki, that is a pretty cool piece of information as well for those of you who love all like the little spooky ghost story type things. But anyways, that's it for another episode. I really appreciate you guys hanging in there for another one, and shoot me over some requests, okay? I know I've got a little lineup that I'm working on right now. Like I mentioned in last week's episode, I have notes going on for a few other cases. I'm going to be doing another one for the Patreon this week. So you guys will be seeing that announcement on Instagram soon. So if you decide that you want to become a patron, you can go on and listen to that one as well as the other ones that I've already put on there. But there's lots of good stuff on there, and I just really hope that you enjoy. Well, I imagine you do enjoy it because y'all keep coming back and listening and telling your friends and coming back for more. But if there's something in particular that you want to hear about, you know, don't hesitate to ever reach out and let me know, because I love adding new cases to the list. And because I kind of start researching cases on a whim, kind of based on my mood, and I need to start like mixing them up more. That's why today I put one, you know, a case of that has a survivor in it, because, you know, they just get so dark. And even though this one was super dark too, it was really, really great that we had this little palate cleanser where, you know, the victim actually survived. At least one of the victims survived and went on to make a life for herself. So anyways, guys, hope you have an amazing rest of the week ahead of us. And until next time, keep talking crime. Whoop, whoop.